This so-called plan, and by the way, I don't believe a word that comes out of Karoline Leavitt's mouth, is something that could have been easily scripted by the Kremlin. It has mostly everything that they've asked for, and it's absurd and obscene.
Now, Volodymyr Zelensky has met with US officials to discuss a new peace plan to end the war in Ukraine. The proposal has been criticised for being agreed in secret between the United States and Russia last month, with the plans involving Ukraine ceding the Donbas region to Moscow. Here's White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt talking about it in the last few hours.
Special Envoy Witkoff, that Marco Rubio have been working on a plan quietly for about the last month. They've been engaging with both sides, Russia and Ukraine, equally to understand what these countries would commit to in order to see a lasting and durable peace. That's how you get to a peace negotiation, right? The president supports this plan. It's a good plan, and we believe that it should be acceptable to both sides, and we're working very hard to get it done. And I'll also add, I know Secretary Driscoll did meet with President Zelensky today. We spoke with him. He was very optimistic following that meeting, and so again, we are having good conversations with both sides with respect to ending this war.
Well, this all comes ahead of the G20 summit in Johannesburg this weekend, which will see Keir Starmer in attendance and could well be dominated by Ukraine. Michael Bociurkiw is a global affairs analyst and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's in South Africa ahead of the G20. Good evening, Michael.
Good evening. Great to be with you.
Yeah, great to have you with us. Just a couple of G20 things before we go into Ukraine. The US has boycotted or had boycotted it because of the treatment of white South African farmers, they say. But I understand that they may be changing their mind on that one.
Well, you know, the South Africans are very crafty in a good way. They've told the Americans, okay, you guys are going to be taking over the G20 presidency, of course, holding the summit next year in Miami. If that's to happen, you actually have to come to South Africa and kind of get the keys to the car, so to speak. But, you know, talking to ordinary people here, talking to officials here, talking to representatives of civil societies, they don't give a hoot that the Americans are gone. In fact, they're happy with it because of these ridiculous allegations they've come up with, genocide of, you know, white South Africans. And, you know, it's interesting looking at the kind of power dynamics here because Xi Jinping is not coming. He's sending his premier instead. Vladimir Putin is too scared to come, so they're sending a low-level official. Lula of Brazil will be here, but I think having covered the BRICS summit here, there is one person who couldn't be happier with the absentee list, and that is Mr. Modi of India. I think he's going to grab the spotlight, and with the link to Ukraine, hopefully he will push forward some discussion here about not only how to settle the conflict of Ukraine, but the other parts of the rules-based international order that seems to be quite a bit of freefall.
Yes, it was the South African president who said today that the US might reconsider their decision to boycott, but the White House have since said it's fake news. Who knows? It may well be that they need to pick up the torch, as it were. Let's talk about Ukraine and what's happening then, because this will dominate some of the discussions. Ukraine are irked, to say the least, that this plan has been devised by the US and Russia with seemingly no Ukrainian input whatsoever. What are your thoughts on this, Michael?
Well, it's a terrible state of affairs, and of course, no participation by the Europeans either. This so-called plan, and by the way, I don't believe a word that comes out of Karoline Leavitt's mouth, is something that could have been easily scripted by the Kremlin. It has mostly everything that they've asked for, and it's absurd and obscene what's being asked for, including limiting the size of Ukraine's military, saying Ukraine can't get into NATO, no NATO troops on the ground, so there goes the coalition of the willing. I think I also heard something today right down to the micro level of Western diplomats not being able to come to Ukraine. So if you take all of that together, as well as some of the other elements, game over for Ukraine as we know it. It's the key elements of this deal is nothing any Ukrainian president could ever sign. And of course, forgot to mention, one of the biggest points is giving up territory, ceding territory that Russia doesn't even control here. My view on this is, you know what, Americans butt out, focus on the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela, Greenland, or whatever. And I think what the Ukrainians would like to see, and we saw President Zelensky go to Turkey, is give the role back to the Turks. They have Zelensky and Putin and Trump on speed dial. I'm talking about Mr. Erdogan. They have a huge stake in Black Sea security, major investments in Ukraine. And by the way, there are Turkish minority groups in Ukraine as we speak. The problem right now, just to end this thought, is Mr. Zelensky can't really tell the Americans to butt out because they're still providing key intelligence to Ukraine, key weaponry. And unfortunately, the Europeans have delayed investments in defense, including the United Kingdom, of course. So they're in no position to take the place of the U.S.
Look, it's going to be a fascinating weekend ahead. We may well check in with you again. Michael Bociurkiw, thank you for being with us, Global Affairs Analyst and a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council in South Africa for the G20 summit that takes place this weekend.
Let's speak to Dr. Donald Jensen first, who's a former diplomat at the US Embassy in Moscow and adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Jensen, thank you for being with us. You will have had, I assume you've had a look at the plan and have perhaps pieced together as much of it as you can in the short time that we've had with it. What's your take?
Well, I guess I would say, this is my opinion, I'm disappointed. It's really a largely warmed over version of Russia's earlier positions, especially in Istanbul 3 years ago and in Alaska, with laid on top of it the Trump concerns about Ukraine concerns about security, about the refugees, about the children who have been kidnapped. But there's a lot of vague terminology there. And unfortunately, that vagueness can be used or twisted by Moscow to get its interpretation of what it wants to happen there at all. But the point what you just made, that it effectively subordinates Ukraine to Russian security needs, is very true. They want to give Ukraine a diminished army. There are a couple concessions about Air Force in Poland and things like that from Western countries, but really, this really will weaken Ukraine's war effort at a time when we don't need that. But let's see how it goes. Zelensky said earlier today, as you pointed out, that he'll talk to Trump about it. I expect some things will change. But the essential trade-off is giving Russia concrete things like Ukrainian land and Donbass in exchange for assurances, security guarantees, and that kind of thing. And as we know, if you follow Ukraine, we gave them that in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, and it didn't work. How you're going to respond to a Russian violation of the treaty, the understanding, whatever you want to call this, is really left up in the air. And I have a great deal of misgivings about the U.S. or any other Western European country stationing troops there or responding in a coherent pushback that would deter Russia from doing more aggressive things.
Okay, and so let's pick apart some of those things. One of the sort of central issues here is that the Ukrainian army will be sort of much diminished. I guess they will hand over certain weapons and reduce the size of its army. Why would that be in Europe and presumably the US's interest to pursue that kind of foreign policy?
Well, the problem is Ukraine is defending Europe, and Ukraine is defending Europe with high technology weaponry, and that is not really mentioned very strongly at all in the document that came out a few hours ago. Ukraine has the world's most advanced drone technology, and that's not mentioned. And to augment the diminished role of the Ukrainian military, you're going to have Ukraine have weapons such as that. And conceivably, NATO or the NATO or the United States would give that to them. But it's not at all clear. And having sat at a negotiating table with the Russians myself, they pick on every little loophole. And I'm certain that some of these loopholes that we see in the document that just was released are intentionally left there by the Russians so they can get their way.
Right, okay. This also sort of basically welcomes Russia back, doesn't it? Certainly economically, Russia will be welcomed back, it says, into the sort of global economic ecosystem, if you will. Is that reasonable to expect that to happen?
I don't think it's realistic at all. Take sanctions, for example. There's a reference to sanctions in the document where we talk about them. The document speaks of them being dropped. But these sanctions are imposed by many layers of government, many European countries. I don't think a lot of these countries are going to just drop the sanctions regime just because of a draft treaty like this. This is going to take a multi-year effort. human costs of the war, which has been horrific. 20,000 Ukrainian children kidnapped, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians killed, cities destroyed, that kind of thing is really glossed over, in my opinion, in the most, let's face it, light, superficial way. They mentioned the Zaporozhye nuclear reactor, which is supposed to divide its energy exports between Russia and Ukraine. Well, why would we do that? That's a Ukrainian nuclear reactor. Why would we do that? Well, because some people are going to try to force Ukraine to agree to conditions like this, which simply aren't realistic. There's an element of humiliation here, let's call it that, because it does have some good points, I admit that, which is to say, Russia has spent almost 2 years trying to take back all the land in Lugansk in the east, all the land in Donbass in the east, and Russia still hasn't done that. It still hasn't done that, because the people are resisting, if they're still alive, and Ukraine has fought an admirable defensive series of offensive to stop the Russian advance. Now, all of a sudden, we're going to just hand over hundreds of thousands of square kilometers to the Ukraine, to the Russian military. I just find that hard to believe. It will never work, because if you know the Ukrainians, and I think I do pretty well, they're going to fight for their ground for till the end. Okay. And they're not hand over and withdraw just because some document says so.
Just to be clear on that, it's as far as territories, it says that Crimea, Luhansk and Donetsk will be recognised as de facto Russian, it says, including by the United States. The US will make that recognition. Kherson, Zaporizhia will be frozen along the lines of the conflict, which will be a de facto recognition along that line of contact. And Russia will relinquish other agreed territories it controls outside the 5 regions, but it doesn't go into detail as to what that actually is. That remains quite vague.
Exactly. If I could add here, the territories that Russia is asked to relinquish are very, very small compared to these formerly very industrially powerful East Ukrainian cities, and where they speak Russian, but there's no indication at all that the people who are left want to join Russia at all. It's just a propaganda point.
Sure, that's important context. Why are we having this conversation tonight? Why are we talking about it? Why do we have this plan? I mean, there's some suggestion that this was leaked perhaps by Russia, that perhaps it's in their interest that we're talking about this in these terms in a way that sort of perhaps spooks Ukraine maybe at a pivotal time of negotiations?
Well, I think the fundamental reason is that Russia's not really budged much at all since the beginning of the war. This document proves it. But the Russians negotiate very differently than the West does. We all know the backgrounds of Secretary Rubio and Envoy Witkoff and the president himself. These are not people accustomed to dealing with, let's say, Russian hybrid warfare, where they do one thing and say another. For Russia, negotiations about they win and we lose. And that's still what we see today, what we saw in Alaska, what we saw every day before then. This is the Russian way of negotiations, where they see this as an extension of the war. And Russia's broader goal now is not just eastern lands in Ukraine. Russia's broader goal is to reconstitute Russia, the country, as a superpower, a dominant power in Europe, and that means the pressure against Europe will continue.